The midterm exam is now on Courseworks. It is under syllabus for session 10, or week 10. And it is a take-home essay. All the instructions are there, the materials you need, and it will be due on the day that it states that it is to be due, which I don't actually remember, but 18th, yes, 18th, doing the 18th. The chapter that you are to be reading for this week is on pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas. There was a taste of this in an earlier chapter because of poor conceptualization on the part of the authors as to how to group topics. So I haven't really talked about pre-Columbian America before now. And in fact, this is the first lecture I've ever given on pre-Columbian America in any context. It's an area that is quite different from the ones that historians are more comfortable with. For parts of the world that have very little written history, such as sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia, they also have fairly meager archaeological findings up to this point. And therefore, it seems like the traditional approach of historians using printed sources is compounded by a lack of material sources. When you come to pre-Columbian America, you have not a complete absence of written sources, because you did have written languages developing late in the pre-Columbian period, and then you had the things that were written by the Spaniards and the Portuguese when they came, and others. Nevertheless, for the earlier phases of pre-Columbian history, there are no written sources, but there are enormous reservoirs of archaeological material. Archaeologists and historians do not always play well together. I was recently reading an article dealing with this part of the world by an English historian who said that in England, archaeology grew up as a part of history. It sort of dealt with the earlier phases of history or the material concomitants of some historical development, but that in America, it grew up as part of anthropology. And in his view, anthropologists and historians don't see the world through the same optic. And this is sort of embodied in the phrase, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. For archaeologists, there is a strong tendency to say, if we have not found something, it wasn't there. For historians, they often say, if we haven't found anything yet, it doesn't mean it wasn't there. It simply means it may have been perishable. It may have been so poorly distributed that we haven't happened onto something, but we shouldn't count it out simply because we haven't found it yet. And here you have a tendency of historians to make comparative appraisals, saying, well, X exists in this parallel configuration in some other area, therefore it probably existed in this other area. For pre-Columbian America, whether or not archaeology really is quite the iron trap that it appears to be, you have a compounding of things by the more recent use of materials that are not in the first order archaeological, such as computer simulations, DNA analyses, and the like, where you may work from a datum or some collection of data, and then handle these data through means that are not typical of historians or even for the earlier generations of archaeologists. This comes up in a number of kind of test cases, the first of which is the theory of megafaunal extinctions. In the 1960s, this was a theory that hit the academic world as kind of a bombshell, sort of like the more or less contemporary theory of the extinction of the dinosaurs being caused by an asteroid impact. Megafaunal, the term megafaunal refers to big animals. You could say that megafaunal extinction is about big animal extinction. But why would you say big animal when you can say megafaunal? And give a little hint of exoticism and mystery to what's actually a fairly simple idea or observation, namely that in many parts of the world, animals that are big, and these people define big pretty precisely. It'll be like, say, over 100 kilos, or bigger than you and me. Of course, bigger than me is hard, but so we're talking about biggish animals. And it's been observed that they have disappeared in different parts of the world, and that in a very, very rough equation, they seem to disappear right around the time the first humans show up. So for Australia, where the big animals in Australia seem to disappear maybe 40,000 years ago, and humans may have shown up around the same time, there is the thought, well, maybe the humans killed all the animals. For the Caribbean islands, the big animals disappeared 5,000 years ago. And that's thought to be roughly when the first Native Americans settled in the Caribbean islands. For islands in different parts of the world, it is fairly easy to ascertain that big animals are killed by humans. The most notorious case, of course, is the dodo, a large flightless bird on the island of Mauritius, which was absolutely delicious, apparently. And so, once the island of Mauritius was found, you would have European ships that would stop there, kill themselves a whole larder full of dodos, pack them in salt, put them on board, and then eat dodo for a lot. And then they got there and found there were no dodos left. And so the island of Mauritius still has the dodo on its coat of arms. And of course, with rising sea levels, there may soon be no island of Mauritius left. But for what is true of an island is much harder to affirm with respect to a continent. So when the big animals disappeared from Australia, the idea that they were eliminated by the humans using Paleolithic killing implements seemed to be a stretch to some people, and seemed to be self-evident for other people, because otherwise why would you have a correlation in time? Now, you get to the New World. I'm not going to talk about Australia here. When you get to the Western Hemisphere, to the New World, the period of the megafaunal extinctions, so the time when the big animals disappeared, seems to be at the end of the last ice age, very roughly around 14,000 years ago, or 12,000 BC. And lo and behold, that is when humans arrived. Unless the humans arrived a lot earlier. And this has been a problem in that there have been numerous archaeological sites in different parts of both North and South America that have been suggestive of the idea that humans arrived well before 14,000 years ago. But there is nothing that has been confirmed. These are usually sites where you will have an assemblage of stones that in one person's eyes looks like a pile of stones, another person's eyes it looks like a pile of human crafted implements. But in terms of datable material, it's hard to come up with a firm case of substantially earlier human settlement. But if, of course, the human settlement was earlier, then the correlation with the big animal extinctions obviously fails. What were the big animals? Mastodons, which are relatives of mammoths, which are relatives of elephants, were a North American species that disappeared. The giant ground sloth disappeared. Horses and camels disappeared, not huge animals by comparison with a mastodon or a giant ground sloth, but big enough to fall into the big animal category. Saber-tooth cats disappeared. You can make up a list of the big animals that disappeared that will enumerate, dozens of species. But there were big animals that did not disappear. So that bison did not disappear. Moose did not disappear. Caribou did not disappear. Jaguars did not disappear. Tapirs in South America did not disappear. The camelids of South America, the llamas, the guanacos, and the guanacos, actually the guanacos primarily, they're the wild species, did not disappear. So the people who have argued for the extinction of big animals by humans have also faced the issue of why some species and not others. There are alternative, let's take the overkill theory. In order to make that work, people who backed that theory did computer simulations. They said that if people entered, let us say, January 1st, 14,000 years ago, and they extended their habitable area at a certain rate of so many kilometers per year, they would have had enough time in this extension to kill every living thing that they encountered if they were so inclined to do it. And this is where the comparative examples become sort of a test. Why would humans have wanted to kill all of the big animals? Why would they have done that? By the time you get to 14,000 years ago, human art has already developed quite a bit, so that you think of the cave paintings that you have in southern France or northern Spain, and you see that humans were perfectly able to represent the animals that lived in their environments. But they don't, in fact, and there are many, many assemblages of petroglyphs, that is to say, stone paintings or carvings in the Americas. but they don't show giant ground sloths and mastodons and saber-toothed tigers and so forth. In other words, the animals that they were alleged to be bent on killing to the point of extinction don't show up in their imaginary. And that seems to be a contradiction. From a historian's point of view, you'd say, well, you know, it's precisely the animals that were hunted that seem to show up in Europe in the Mesolithic or the Paleolithic, and here the animals that show up are moose, caribou, bighorn sheep, bison. The animals that show up are the animals that we know historically were around. In order to support the overkill theory, it's been hypothesized that people learned through the use of fire to stampede animals into perilous places where they were boxed into a canyon or they ran over a cliff and died. And, you know, I'm from the Middle West. You go a long, long, long way looking for a cliff that an animal can't scramble down. You know, how they killed every animal in Nebraska is hard to tell. But of course they did. Nebraska was full of bison. They didn't kill them. Yeah.
What do they do with the animal to bring it out of the cliff once it's come to 100 feet down?
Well, this, of course, was the problem. That now you have a lot of dead animals. And presumably what you do then is you dance. You know, you do one of these big animal kill dances, and that's it. There have been a total of 14 locales where human remains have been found in conjunction with mastodon remains. No other large animal has been found in conjunction with human remains in a context that suggests a killing. So this is one of these cases where is the absence of evidence the evidence of absence. The people who favor the overkill theory says, well, you know, you never really find, archaeologically, you never find an animal that has a, somebody's written on the antler, killed by, John Doe on such and such a date. Kill sites are not normal, and therefore, if you don't find any, it doesn't mean anything at all. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. On the other hand, when you look at the distribution of population, you really do find yourself puzzled as to how in sparsely inhabited areas, the animals disappear seemingly more than in the densely inhabited areas. So when you get down to South America and Central America, where you have jaguars and so forth, a denser population than you would have in the Great Plains of the United States, and yet the animals remained. Obviously, I'm not a fan of the overkill theory. Jared Diamond is. If you've read Guns, Germs, and Steel, it is one of a series of bad judgment calls, I think, that he made in that book, because he compounded the problem. He didn't simply rely on the computer simulations or the chance archaeological finds, but rather he said that the animals that the humans found when they came to the Americans were not familiar with humans, and therefore they didn't know enough to be afraid. They hadn't seen aliens. They didn't know that, alien beings are going to kill you if you don't watch out. Whereas the animals in the old world, which humans failed to exterminate, of course they did exterminate the mammoths perhaps, but they didn't exterminate the great herds of animals in Africa or the Eurasian steppe or something. His argument is, well, those animals really knew that humans were dangerous, and therefore they knew to run away, be afraid, be very afraid. And there's a certain plausibility to it until you think, well, this is what got the scientist Lamarck in trouble by saying that you had the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Because no animal of any species, including humans, has ever seen a human until they're born. So that their appraisal of a human, for good or ill, is something that they acquire in the course of their lifetime. But the doctrine that is generally accepted in evolutionary theory, that you cannot pass on by inheritance an acquired characteristic, would say that supposing you've learned to be afraid of people, you learned that, and you can't pass it on to your offspring genetically. Now, you could pass it on culturally, conceivably. In other words, you could school your cubs or your foals or your offspring to be afraid of humans. But this is also assuming that humans have a certain commonness in the landscape. And there's a question of the degree to which non-human species have a cultural context to pass on and so forth. But even then, it's very hard to see to imagine Mama and Papa saber-toothed tiger saying to the cubs, you know, beware of the humans, as opposed to saying, eat the humans. Because some of the animals that were exterminated were very, very dangerous animals, the dire wolf, the saber-toothed cats, and so on. So Diamond goes with sort of a Lamarckian theory, and he says the reason that the caribou and the bison and, well, primarily caribou and the bison and the moose do not, the reason they survive is that you had them in Europe, and that therefore they presumably, you know, sent telegrams ahead saying, you know, people coming, warning, folks coming into your territory, beware of them. Okay, lampooning Jared Diamond is one of my favorite activities, but I'll stop here because I've done enough to get the point across. There are other theories. There's a theory that illness killed off the big animals. Maybe the humans brought the illness with them, but nobody's found any pathogen that would support that idea. There's the idea that there was a climate change, what's known as the Lesser Dryas, or the Younger Dryas period, a brief period of reglaciation, brief meaning a few hundred years. But then it's argued that, well, these are species that lived through the bad ice age. Why were they just going to, you know, flop over and die in a kind of just 200 years of renewed cold weather? So there's the idea that, you know, you have overkill, over-ill, over-chill, and I just picked this up on a website. I thought it was kind of neat. And the other one didn't work too well, but it was, what was it? Anyway, it had to do with the idea that there must have been a comet or an asteroid that blew up in the air and killed them all. All right, we don't have the foggiest idea what happened to the big animals. We have theories. But that a fortiori goes for pretty much everything else in pre-Columbian America. We don't generally know what happened, and usually in a particular level, we know even less. And therefore, it is open to theories and to competing theories. When you read a chapter on pre-Columbian America of the sort that you read in my book, or pretty much in any of the competing world history books, you find that the Western Hemisphere is treated as separate, as sort of a self-contained part of the planetary past. Now, you could argue, I suppose, that being surrounded by oceans that separate these continents by thousands of miles from others warrants this separation. But if you take a comparative view and you look at it from a global perspective, you begin to ask questions that aren't always asked that much. In the ancient Mediterranean world, there was an idea put forward by the geographer Ptolemy and supported in a somewhat different form by Aristotle and then picked up by Arab and Persian writers. The idea that the world is a sphere, a globe, and it is divided into a series of climes. Usually 7 climes for Ptolemy. For Aristotle, it was 5 climes. But you have the idea that you have these bands that characterize the globe at certain, certain levels of remove from the equator, with the equator coming along in here. These climes will then be characterized. And the most common characterization of the equatorial climb in here, the middle climb, is that it is uninhabitable or near to it. And this is borne out by various speculations that the closer you get to the equator, people are burned brown by the sun, and you have no civilization as you get into areas that are too hot, and so forth and so on. And then when you get up here, that's just too cold. So you don't have anything there. So it's the temperate zones, north and south, that theoretically is where you have civilization. And as luck would have it, Ptolemy and Aristotle both lived in such a temperate zone, and therefore they thought that this was fairly self-evident. And indeed, it has been taken almost as self-evident by historians ever since. That is to say, down to the present day, when people look at the tropics, they say, well, we don't find civilization or widespread agriculture or such and such here or there in the tropics because they are the tropics. And where we look for the origins of everything worthwhile is in the temperate zones. But then when you look at the Americas, it flips. The civilizational developments in the Americas, that is, say, the ones that culminate from the point of view of the European incoming peoples in the Aztecs of Mexico and the Incas of Peru, these civilizations are all in the equatorial zone. And the temperate zones are sparsely populated, have a much lower level of material culture, do not develop written languages, do not seem to develop to the same degree the urban arts and characteristics that you have in the tropical or the equatorial zone. And when you do find them, these sorts of developments, you can usually trace them back to a dissemination from the equatorial zone. That is to say, you can, early Indian or Native American remains in southern Florida, attributed to the Calusa people, have aspects that appear to represent a dissemination of cultural practices from the Maya, who are in Mexico, Belize, Honduras, so forth in Central America. Same thing for the earliest quasi-urbanized peoples in the American Southwest, the Anasazi in the southwest. They have characteristics that are thought to disseminate from the Equatorial Zone. Now, by thought to disseminate, this is, of course, an archaeological judgment where you find ceramic elements or architectural elements or pictorial elements, and you try to see where they might come from. But there are more concrete signs of dissemination, and this has to do with the spread of crops. And in particular, the great cereal of the New World, maize or corn, which spreads up to North America and spreads south into South America from some point of development in Central America, or perhaps in Mexico proper. So we know that things did move. When it comes to foodstuffs and cultivation, the degree to which other cultural aspects moved is more debatable. But going back to this question of why does this happen in the Equatorial Zone? When you look at parallel equatorial zones, as I said, in Africa or Southeast Asia in particular, it's hard to see why the Central American area stands out. Now, a comparison has been made between the Lowland Mayan civilization. Now, Mexico comes down here and it has a big peninsula that sets up. That's the Yucatan Peninsula. And then you get the rest of Central America. So you have El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, state of Yucatan, Chiapas state, and so forth. And the lowland Maya are the ones here in the Yucatan. This is mostly mountainous down here in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras. The earliest civilization was over here on the west coast, the Olmecs, and many of the cultural characteristics of the Maya seem to come from the earlier Olmecs. In people who've tried to put together Mayan chronology, we'll talk about a population moving into the Mayan lowlands somewhere 2000 to 1000 BC, and then you get classic Mayan stuff, in, let's say, after 200 or 300 AD. In other words, it's a long period of development. It seems as though there were no human inhabitants in the lowland Mayan area prior to this migration. What this does to the notion of big animal extinction, if you have areas that humans didn't get to, you'd think, hey, all the big animals will go there and just hang out because there aren't any humans around. But the comparison that's been made is between the Mayan lowlands and southeastern Nigeria, which is where the Igbo people live. The soils are very similar. The rainfall and temperature patterns are quite similar, including what months you get maximum precipitation and so forth. The crops they grow are similar in the sense that they are primarily root crops, yams, and yams in Nigeria and manioc or cassava in the Maya territory, plus a grain. It would be maize in the New World and sorghum in the Old. And so, the question is asked, if you have exactly similar conditions in this equatorial zone, do you need to explain why one generates a major civilization? And I'm talking pyramids and human sacrifice and all those things that we associate with major civilizations. Whereas another gradually moves from slash and burn agriculture toward local garden agriculture. Big deal. I mean, why is there a dissimilarity? You could take other comparisons. You can take going farther south, the coastal plain of Peru. Peru is just south of Ecuador. Ecuador, curiously, is on the equator, which is why it's called Ecuador. And the coast of Ecuador is heavily forested and jungly. Guayaquil, which is the major seaport of Ecuador, is just around a river that's just full of jungle floating out to sea, which presumably is where the animals and birds and so forth of the Galapagos Islands came from. The flotsam from Guayaquil area, stuff that floated out to sea and floated all the way halfway across the Pacific and ended up in the Galapagos Islands. But once you get south of Ecuador, the coast becomes a desert. And so you have a coastal desert just south of the equator. And it's a narrow coastal plain with the Andes Mountains coming up behind it. So you're in an equatorial zone, you're in an arid environment, and this is where civilizations develop. The Chavin civilization, the Moche, ultimately the Incas are highland peoples, but they control the people in the lowland areas. So it isn't a matter that it's rainforest or dense bush that gives rise to a civilization in the equatorial New World. It's also a coastal desert that gives rise to civilization in the New World. All in the equatorial zone. You can take a coastal desert in the temperate zone, let's say from Los Angeles to San Diego, and the native population there, when it was, that we know about from European settlement, were among some of the least materially advanced peoples in North America. That was a desert on the coast that really was didn't seem to be able to support much. Whereas here you have a desert on the coast in Peru that supports substantial population, substantial civilization. Now you could say, as people have, that in Peru there is a cold current that brings a lot of fish, and therefore, boy, a lot of anchovies there, and therefore there's civilization. On the other hand, the Portuguese tuna fleet in San Diego feels that there's a lot of fish up in Southern California as well, so I'm not quite sure whether fish resources provide your only answer. The La Nina, El Nino oscillation affects Peru, but it affects Pacific areas in general. Since that oscillation has recently been discovered, projecting it back into history has been very, very fragile, because let's say climate history before 1600 AD tends to be big event climate history, a volcano or some other dramatic occasion, whereas the current oscillations in the Pacific haven't been pushed that far back, to the best of my knowledge, as far as I've read into it. But that would simply mean that for those people in Peru, there would be some bad years. Mostly good years, and then you have a change in the El Nino, La Nina oscillation, and then you have some bad years. Anyway, it's puzzling. Now, if you were to go back and read the chapter in The Earth and Its Peoples that touches on Africa for the first time, that was a chapter that, it was a chapter 6, I think, on communications among peoples, or something really gripping like that. But it dealt with the Silk Road and the Saharan trade and Indian Ocean trade, and with the dissemination of the Bantu in Africa. My colleague, fellow writer David Northrop, wrote the African piece of the chapter, and he was drawn to the theory that the reason the African polities remain small and fragmented and never come together into big states is that there was so much space. That if you had some kind of population pressure or friction, you could, trek 20 miles off and start over. And that you didn't have a conflict that was unavoidable because of the constraints of the locality. So he argued that the African societies of ancient times, starting with the Bantu migrations and continuing down to modern times, he argued that these societies have very, very strikingly similar cultural aspects, whether in the nature of kinship or the nature of rule, or the use of masks, or the use of music, the type of agriculture, and he would argue that they're similar because they're all disseminating basically from a hearth thought to be somewhere around West Africa, sort of the southwest portion of the African savanna, and that they never develop into a urban civilization because they were able to manage conflict by separation, and that you had small kingdoms or chieftainships that would have a particular form, but by and large they did not find themselves in unavoidable conflict situations that led to A conquering B, C, and D and setting up a state. I don't know how common that theory is among Africanists today. But just taking it as a hypothesis, when you look at the Equatorial Zone in Africa, and you say, this is one of the most spacious areas in the world. You have essentially flat land all the way from the Atlantic Ocean across to the mountainous areas of Ethiopia and Kenya and the Rift Valley of East Africa. In other words, if avoidance of conflict through movement and resettlement was desirable, this is the ideal place to do it, because there is so much space, the terrain is comparatively uniform, and you could do it. Doesn't mean you did do it or felt you had to, but you could do it. Then you look at the Equatorial Zone in the New World, and you say there's no place in the world that has less space. No place in the world that has less space. You're confined between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean if you're in Central America, and it is a heavily mountainous area, and as you move south, the mountains are very close to the coast, the Andes Mountains, and the civilizations are developing in that narrow space between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes Mountains, just as, say, in lowland Mayan areas, it's mountains here on the west and the south, and people are coming into essentially a cul-de-sac. There's no place to go from the Yucatan. So if you were to take this as an explanation for Africa, then you might flip it and say, it may be that the reason you had civilization in the Peruvian coast and in Central America is because there was so little space. And people, when they found themselves in conflict, conflicted. They couldn't move any place. When you read works on the emergence of the Maya, this is not explicitly there as a theory, but rather it is implicit in the sense that population pressure is seen as the goad for the development of a sophisticated civilization with large and ornate ceremonial centers and so forth in the lowland Maya region. Initially you just had scattered settlements that had some pottery, but as the population grew, there was no place to expand, and therefore it intensifies. So then you would say, well, if that is this week's nutty bullet theory, how do we handle that for Indonesia? That's in the tropics, and it's confined, but you don't have elaborate civilizations there. It's confined because it's spread out over a whole bunch of islands. But as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, this is where sailing developed. So that you did, in fact, have people who could practice conflict avoidance through migration. And the theory that all of the Polynesian islands and Melanesian territories were settled by people originally from the Indonesia to Philippines zone, or at least using the technologies that disseminate from that zone. You could say, well, maybe that is the equivalent of what you had in Africa by simply moving from one place to another in order to avoid conflict. Then you could say, well, let's look at the temperate zones. North America, the country that we love, America, America the Beautiful. But America the pretty much uninhabited. There was lots of room, going east and west for avoidance. You can look at Central Asia and you say, well, Central Asia, which has vast amounts of room, it didn't develop civilization in the same way that the Mediterranean did. Well, what's the Mediterranean? It's a whole slew of converging mountain ranges with islands, and they're all facing each other. If you're going to have conflict, what a great place to have conflict. Because every little valley, every little island provides a kind of an inescapable environment. So when we read in ancient history about the migrations of the sea peoples, the Hyksos who invaded Egypt, or the Philistines who invaded the coastal Holy Land, it seems natural to say, well, you had conflict, and so people got in their boats and they left, but there was no place to go that wasn't already inhabited, and so they come and they fight for dominion in Libya, or they fight for dominion in Israel, or they fight for dominion in Sardinia. That's simply the way things are. And so you get these tendencies towards civilization. Earlier on, you could say, well, what about the river valley civilizations? The Indus Valley, the Tigris, Euphrates, the Nile. You could say, well, yeah, there's lots of room, but it's real dry. And sure, you could say, okay, we're having a conflict with you here along this riverbank here in Iraq, but we're going to avoid the conflict. We're going to move out into the desert 20 miles, and we're going to die. Despite the fact that it looks on a general map like an area of with enormous possibility for expansion, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt are remarkably constrained environments. You simply cannot, if you go to Egypt and you stand in the desert on one side of the Nile and you look across the Nile, you see the desert on the other side. That is the width of Egypt. And everybody lives there between those two deserts. So this would conduce toward a theory that lack of Lebensraum, the lack of space to live in, the lack of group mobility to serve as to vent the pressures caused by conflict or by overpopulation or things like that, that lack of space conduces toward the growth of civilization. And an amplitude of space leads to a sparse population that is more mobile and less given to the sorts of conflict that you find in the civilizational areas. Now, I think this is a really cool theory. Now I can explain the history of the world through this theory. Why we have civilization in some areas and not in other areas. And I thought of it yesterday. I was saying, I have to lecture on New World this week. And, what can I say as someone who is, just bone ignorant on the subject? What can I say that would be new and different? And I thought, well, I have to draw on what I know, and that is the other parts of the world. And so I was struck in reading the things by people who work on pre-Columbian America by how rarely they talk about other parts of the world, and the degree to which it is a kind of not hermetically sealed, but a comparatively sealed study in how do you think about the past, that you don't think in global terms. You think in hemispheric terms because you assume that those oceans are providing an insulation from things that are characteristic of humans elsewhere in the world. The common factor, of course, is that people are people. I mean, the territory may be separate, but people tend to do the same things under certain circumstances, wherever they are in the world. So going back to an idea I talked about at the very beginning of this course about the idea of common denominators. Nobody is surprised to find that the pre-Columbian societies, whether they were heavily developed civilizations as you have in the Andes and Central America, or whether they are sparsely settled areas that you would have in temperate zones in north and south, nobody is surprised to find that they have art, because that's what humans do. Now, the art looks different, but nobody is surprised when the most developed and densely populated areas begin to develop techniques of keeping records. Nobody is surprised to find that the calendar and astronomy proved to be an interest in the Western Hemisphere as they proved to be interested in the Eastern Hemisphere. No one is surprised by pyramids and big stone architecture. In other words, the human characteristics seem to strike everyone as being appropriate to the species, and yet they tend to be reluctant to look at what that species is doing in other places in possibly comparable or or opposite circumstances. Now that brings me to domestic animals. In Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, oh, poor Diamond, I'm back on him again. He maintains that all animals, all big animals that can be domesticated were domesticated by 2000 BC. And that if you had in the Americas big animals that were not domesticated by 2000 BC, or domesticated at all in his view, it is because they couldn't be. This is sort of going to the theory of absence of evidence is evidence of absence. What this outlook depends upon is the notion that certain animals are prone to domestication, not prone, that's the wrong word, they are ripe for domestication, and other species are not. And that comes to be a sort of a self-fulfilling designation. If a species becomes domestic, then it was ready to be domesticated. It was hanging around, you're like, this little piggy wants a leash around his neck. But if you have a species that did not become domestic, then it couldn't become domestic. The fact that today most of the bison in America are domestic was an inconvenience that he was happy to overlook. The fact that the caribou of North America, which he claims cannot be domesticated, are the same species as the reindeer of the old world, which are domestic, was sort of that would have been a difficult thing to accommodate if he had bothered to put it in the book. In other words, there's a certain selection of data to fit a preordained theory. But it highlighted the problem of why humans do certain things. In other words, if you're talking about common denominators, you can talk about humans doing categories of things. In other words, humans may have gods, they may dance, they may feed themselves, something like that. But is that the same thing as humans doing specific things? Will humans try to domesticate animals? And that really is sort of the key thing here, because if you take it that trying to domesticate animals is a common denominator, that's a human propensity, then the fact that you didn't have any in the New World, except for the dog and the llama and the turkey, the guinea pig, etc. The fact you didn't have any in the New World would indicate that the people in the New World tried and failed. And that does not fit Diamond's notion that all humans have equal astuteness in living in the world. That if you're a chieftain in New Guinea or a chieftain in Washington, D.C., the inequality that is apparent in terms of your health and power is a happenstance that says nothing about your, the difference between you as people. So this was a problem. How do you account for the absence of domestic animals in the Western Hemisphere? It's a somewhat different story from the one of big animal extinctions. With the big animal extinctions, the hypothesis was that the people who came to the New World, like the people who came to Australia, 15,000 years earlier, or the people who came to Cuba 10,000 years later, 15,000 years later, that they had a common characteristic, which was their desire to kill everything. But nobody really has postulated that that is a universal human characteristic. Indeed, I think in most societies, wanton killing of every animal around is frowned upon. It's bad for maintenance of the environment. It's bad for maintenance of your diet and so forth. We do have some huge traditions of hunting, particularly for royal hunts. But the idea that of killing everything has rarely been put forward as a common human characteristic. And indeed, the big animal extinction theory has been vociferously denounced by certain writers from the Native American community. They say, no, we love the environment. We love nature. We love animals. Look at our folklore, coyote and magpie and all these characters. We are the lovers of nature. We show up in TV ads with a tear in our eye when we consider the depredations that the white people have inflicted upon us. How can you say that we started as wanton murderers of every animal on the continent? And the Megafauna Extinction people say, yeah, look, I have a computer program here. It shows you could have done it. All you had to do was want to do it. And the fact that you forgot that you wanted to do it should not absolutely, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So there's a problem with why were these people different in that area, and then with the domestic animals, it's a similar question of why were they different with respect to domestic animals. Why didn't they domesticate the caribou? If it's a natural thing for humans to domesticate animals, why didn't they domesticate the bison? Why didn't they domesticate the peccary? The javelina, the wild pigs or pig-like things. There are animals around they could have domesticated. The only one they domesticated was the Wanaco, which becomes the domestic llama. This gets into academic areas having to do with the theory of domestication. I've written about this, and I asked you early on in the course to read some of the stuff I wrote, but let me just recap it a little bit. The problem with thinking about animals becoming domestic is that if you have no domestic animals, you don't know that an animal can be domestic. You don't know that that's an option. And moreover, if you have one domestic animal, you don't necessarily know that it is a domestic variant of an animal that otherwise you know is a wild animal. In other words, if you have a piggy that is eating garbage in your village and you go out to hunt wild boar, do you really think that the piggy evolved from the wild boar? If you do, then your name was Charles Darwin, and you were there thousands of years before your later namesake invented evolution. The idea that one species can turn into another was not an acceptable idea through most of human history, so that even when you had domestic species, unless they were virtually interchangeable with the wild, as say would be the case with reindeer, you wouldn't even know that where it came from. The reason is that it takes generations of genetic separation, reproductive separation from wild stock, in order for the tameness characteristic of domestic animals to become expressed in a genetic fashion. Taming an animal, you can take an animal from the wild, you can raise it from a pup or a cub or a fawn or whatever, and it can be the most tame thing imaginable, and wow, sexual maturity hits and it's a wild animal, just like humans. The maturing process produces huge increases in adrenaline and fight or flight responses, things like that. And the only thing that's going to change that is some sort of genetic suppression of those characteristics, either through a preservation into adulthood of juvenile characteristics, which is what you see with pigs and dogs with their pushed-in juvenile faces. And there are other examples that are given, floppy ears, for example, as opposed to the erect ears of wolves. So you can have a continuation of juvenile characteristics, or you can simply have a genetic changes that favor very low production of adrenaline and related hormones among adult animals. Studies done in the 20th century of the domestication of foxes, the domestication of rats, have shown that after 20 or 30 generations of reproductive isolation, those foxes or rats that have survived, through this repeated process of domesticating within the group, have adrenaline glands that will be, say, a quarter the weight of the adrenaline glands of the wild animals that they started with. And when such an animal becomes angry, hostile, ready to bite or fight or something like that, it just can't keep the anger. It says, it doesn't sustain the characteristics of the wild animal. Oddly enough, animals that inherit calm characteristics once they become domestic seem to have an extremely high reproduction rate in comparison with the wild stock. My sense from studies I've done is that based on the, not studies I've done, but based on the studies I've read about with the foxes and the rats, is that animals that are penned up are so agitated all the time that they can't have sex, that they simply don't have any offspring at all, because it's very hard to be really, really, really wild and have sex. Do not try it yourself. This is a professional driver on a closed course. But you think about it, and when you're absolutely furious, and you want to hit someone, that isn't the time to make out. And supposing you're a wild animal that's living in a high predation environment where, there are eagles, there are hawks, there are foxes, there are hyenas, there are all sorts of things around ready to eat you. You don't have a terribly high reproduction rate. And yet those who are laid back are eaten. So they don't reproduce at all. So in the wild, in high predation environments, it is the wildest ones survive but have comparatively low reproduction rates, whereas the calm ones are eaten before they reach maturity and do not contribute their calm genes to the gene pool. But if they had survived, they would be more capable of reproducing than otherwise. So some people, incidentally, who have studied the big animal extinction rates say, the difference is in the rate of reproduction. That the animals that disappeared were those that had low reproduction rates, and those that survived were those with high reproduction rates, and that it was it wasn't killing so much as any combination of stressful factors affected some species more than others, and that sort of stands to reason that you would have a big difference, and that gets to the issue of the guanaco down in South America. The early descriptions that you get, not even so early, of explorers that go down into Argentina and other places that had large numbers of guanacos. This is an animal related to the camel. They observe that this is an animal that lives out in the desert. It doesn't have predators around. Same thing with camels and certain other desert animals in the old world. They were not subject to a high predation level. And you have these interesting descriptions where you'll have a male guanaco surrounded by his 20 female guanacoettes. And, the intrepid explorer comes up and shoots the male guanaco. And the ladies stand around saying, oh, isn't that interesting? Waiting to see what's going to happen next. They don't run away. And the guanacos were notoriously curious. Look, people, I wonder what they're doing. I'll just go over here and hang out and look at them and so on. And this is a disposition that I call tame in the wild, where you have wild animals that are comparatively tame. And these become easily brought under human control, so that elephants at the top of the food chain, they have no predators, they are comparatively tame even though they are wild. So that all of the so-called domestic elephants of South Asia, none of them are brought up in captivity. They're simply captured and used because they don't care, they're elephants. You want me to pull a log? I'll pull a log, what the hell. Camels, I think, were tame in the wild. They had no predators, at least the one-hump camels of Arabia. If you go to the Galapagos Islands, you see this dramatically. None of the animals have any fight or flight response at all. You say, oh, I want to walk to the end of the room, but there are 1,000 marine iguanas sunning themselves on the rocks between here and the end of the room. Shoo, go away, marine iguanas. Nothing. If you walk forward, they'll inch apart so you don't step on them. But it never occurs to them to get out of your way. But eventually, you've made your way through this sea of marine iguanas. Same thing with the birds. You walk up to a nest, blue-footed booby is nesting, and you look at it, it looks at you. What kind of booby are you? I'm sitting on a nest. What are you doing that's useful? And this phenomenon of tame in the wild is actually fairly widespread, but I think it explains why you have that one animal that makes it. Because it's not domestic animals do not represent a natural human propensity to change animals. Now, why certain species became domestic in certain areas, in my view, has comparatively little to do with, not comparatively little, but has something to do with what the species was and its species characteristics. That has a lot to do with what is the purpose of keeping the animals captive. And there is where I would talk about sacrificing animals, ceremonial killing, and of course in the New World, you didn't need domestic animals for that because you had people. So I will say something about sacrificing humans and playing ball, two very closely related things, on Thursday.